Yeah, my name is Alvin. I will start the session with Dr. Ramadan. Please join me up on stage. And after that, I've got two panelists plus Farah in the flesh to take questions and to discuss what we're going to present in the first 10 to 15 minutes. So I think there's enough news and development in the wealth management space. I think the latest that we've been kind of quite engaged in or following, it's the acquisition of Credit Suisse by UBS. And then we've got digital assets, we've got different ways of servicing customers, and in Singapore in particular, family offices, right? So I think this session, we are trying to review some of the key trends in both the conventional wealth management space, and to our minds at Maybank, we believe that there's some opportunity or a lot of opportunity in Islamic wealth management. A while ago, McKinsey actually described this century, 21st century, as the Asian century. Before that, I think we could have heard of the term China century. Whether it is in an Asian century or a China century, I think there's enough evidence that some of the center of economic gravity has kind of shifted from the Western Hemisphere to Asia. So back in 2010, the Western Hemisphere economies constituted about 70% of global GDP, and Asia was merely 25%. Fast forward 10 years, in 2021, Asia Pacific as a bloc ranks number one at 39% of total GDP, and North America is only 28, Europe is 25. Some of you might remember this article again by Goldman Sachs, and they project that in 2050, the top 6 economies in the world will be China, US, India, Indonesia, Germany, and Japan. 4 out of the 6 are Asian economies. A similar projection by PwC ranked China, India, US, I think it's Indonesia, and then Russia and Brazil as the top 6 economy. Guess what? 4 out of the 5 BRICS economy are on this list. So I think it's safe to say that the center of economic activity or gravity has kind of shifted somewhat to Asia. There's about 83 trillion US dollars in high net worth wealth. This is just high net worth. This is not total wealth. High net worth being $1 million and above. And a lot of it resides in Asia. Granted, I think if you look at the chart, even in North America, the growth has been quite stellar. But if you look at Europe, it is a slower growth than it is in Asia Pacific. And if you double click within Asia Pacific, if you look at Southeast Asia, ChatGPT, next slide, please. Okay. Sorry. So if you look at Southeast Asia, the growth in total wealth is also quite stellar. And the appetite in wealth is not just limited to the old traditional real estate. I think Asians, and in particular Chinese, Indians, people in this part of the world, I think financial assets are increasingly attractive. And I think investors are not afraid to take some liabilities as well, right? Take some facility to kind of double up on their investments. So the wealth creation is not just amongst the high net worth. This slide shows the wealth amongst the middle class. First 2 bar charts shows Asia Pacific, ex-China and India. A very stellar growth. 130 million households in Asia Pacific belongs to the middle class. China has overtaken everybody else at 168 million households. If you look at ASEAN 5, right? Singapore, Malaysia, Thailand, Philippines, and Indonesia. Although the number is small, the growth is 12%, but within this region, it is all the 5 economies here have significant amount of the population who are Muslim. right? That's the reason why we believe that Islamic wealth management has some opportunity. So with this growth of affluence and wealth, what are the key observations, shifting priorities, and attitudes of the investors? So I think there are four. Number one, I believe investors are increasingly international, right? So, and I think the advent of digital channels makes it a lot easier for investors to invest globally. And because of the connectivity within the trading blocks, I think there'll be a lot of rich people being minted amongst the SME entrepreneurs. And that's the reason amongst my panelists, I've got Eugene, who is one of the council member in Association of SME in Singapore. The second observation is that, and this kind of relates to what we heard just in the session earlier about AI, I think investors are definitely increasingly digital. I think with COVID, that kind of becomes even more apparent. So at Maybank, we are trying to also be very cognizant of the fact that customers want hyper-personalization, right? So that's something that we'll do. But to our minds, again, I think much as digital capabilities will be the way to do business, I think in wealth management, it is still a case where a customer would like to talk to a person in flesh occasionally, if not all the time. So we won't compromise the human aspect of relationship, with digital. We believe also that there will be shift towards alternatives, and amongst these will be whether it's private markets or new digital asset, cryptocurrencies and all that. But one of the areas that we'll focus in growing is Islamic wealth management, right? So, and that I will leave to Dr. Ramadan to share more. The last point, with the baby boomers in the age of retirement, I think the wealth transfer will happen. And David Quay, who is CEO of a trust services company, will talk a little bit more about that, right? So I think that's the fourth trend that we observe. So with that, I'll pass the mic over to Dr. Ramadan, who will share a little bit more about Islamic wealth.
Thanks, Alvin. Thank you for providing a high-level account on the landscape of group wealth. So what I will do for the next few slides is to provide a more focused updates on the progress of Islamic wealth management. It's still at a very nascent stage, yet it's a very potential and has a lot of promising values, which is a subset of overall global wealth. So I'm not so familiar with this.
It's a green button.
It's a green button. Sorry. So, so if we look at the report produced by BCG, the report tells us that the growth of Islamic wealth is at comparable rates as the conventional growth or conventional wealth grows. And if we look on the right side of the slides, the proportion of wealth which reside offshore is on the growing or increasing trend. And on this matter, so Singapore is clearly the preferred choice for the global center for Islamic wealth management, especially from the Southeast Asian perspective. Yeah. So I will share a bit more on that in the subsequent information. So just a quick highlights on the landscape of Islamic wealth globally. Of course, the largest Islamic wealth reside in Indonesia. And according to report, apart from the populations, three other contributing factors that really boost Indonesian position as the largest hub for Islamic wealth. The first one is on the rapid growth of GDP. Second, on the rapid growth of urbanization. So they have one of the highest urbanization rates in the world. And the third one is the booming ecosystem for SMEs in Indonesia. And I think we are all know that Indonesia is one of the highest country which have unicorns globally. So definitely, if you want to do Islamic wealth management, so GCC, definitely there is a abundance of opportunity, but Indonesia is a very promising market for Islamic wealth management. This one is just to highlight in terms of the overall trend for Islamic financial assets. So despite 2021 are unique years where all of us under lockdown mode, but the growth of Islamic financial assets are steadily increasing. And if we look at the composition of the Islamic financial assets, banking, which consists of the liability as well as asset, still the biggest components of the overall financial assets. So later we will show when we talk about Islamic wealth solutions. So it's not just about asset accumulation, which is mainly on the investment instruments, but it covers the cradle to grave solutions. So which means how you start creating your asset, how you accumulate them, how you protect them until you do the legacy planning, especially after you passing. Yeah, how you want to create and leave behind a good legacy for the dependents and your legal heirs. Subsequently, I just want to share some key observations in respect to Islamic wealth solutions or Islamic wealth business. So the first one is this gain a lot of momentum, and this also supported by the emerging wave of ethical investing as well as ESG investing. Because people see when we talk about Islamic instruments, they score quite high from ESG scoring parameter perspective. So that's why that also helped to search the performance and the traction of Islamic wealth solution. So that is point number one. Point number two, also we can see from the data points that the size of the Islamic wealth reside in offshore markets is growing. And currently, if you look at the global data, US and Europe are the main destination for the offshore wealth, but Singapore is very attractive and poised to be the primary hub for global offshore wealth within the next 5 years. The third one is the increasing interest among the young affluent Muslims because they are more exposed towards Islamic finance propositions. So this is the case for Indonesia in particular, as well as GCC, based on our research conducted together with Bain & Co. And the last point, this is quite an obvious thing for the perspective of affluent Muslims in Southeast Asia. Singapore is the undisputed hub for the offshore Islamic wealth solutions. We talked about the market data points, starting from Alvin, and then I just expanded on the Islamic wealth management. Now I will wrap up with what we can offer under Maybank Group's Islamic wealth management solution. So again, when we look at Islamic wealth, we are not just looking about, or we are not just looking at wealth accumulation, but we're looking at cradle to grave solutions, which means from the creation, accumulation, preservation, purification, and distribution. I will touch about that in more detail, perhaps during the panelist session. But what I'm pleased to also share with the audience today that we have capabilities to provide meaningful solutions in Singapore, in Malaysia, as well as in Indonesia. So I take a pause here. I will pass back to Alvin just to wrap up this presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramadan. So given the fact that Maybank has footprint in all the 10 ASEAN countries and the key financial centers like Hong Kong, London, New York, and the fact that we are focusing not just banking the high net worth, but the middle income as well, through conventional wealth management and Islamic wealth management, this is our business model, right? So we want to Dr. Ramadan's point, bank our customers from cradle to grave across borders as seamlessly as possible, providing the best investment solutions and advice, augmenting digital capabilities to better serve our customers. So with that, can I invite the panelists up on stage and anyway, it's this. Thanks, Eugene.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Farah, Head of Investment Consultant at Maybank Private. I would be moderating the panel discussion for today. So joining Alvin as well as Dr. Ramadan, we are pleased to have Mr. David Quay. He is the Group CEO at British and Malayan Holdings, and he will be sharing with us the intricacies of wealth transfers amongst high net worth individuals. And we also have Mr. Eugene Tan in the middle. He is the Vice President of Association of Small and Medium Enterprises, and he would be representing to us the views of SMEs as well as entrepreneurs in their wealth management journey. So I would like to keep this session as interactive as possible, so you may key in any questions that you may have by scanning the QR code at the back of your passes and then keying in any questions that you would have for our panelists. So while you key in your questions, I would just like to kickstart the first question for David. Hi, David. There is a Chinese saying that goes, wealth does not last beyond 3 generations. So what would you say would be the key challenges facing intergenerational wealth transfers?
Very common question. As for those who have lived and worked in Asia, the common saying is that the first generation creates the wealth. The second generation tries to maintain the wealth. And typically, the third generation spends the wealth. Right? We've seen a slight difference in, if you compare Asian wealth and, say, the Western world wealth. The Western world wealth has got multiple more generations in advance. And you look at the Asian wealth, it is probably the first generation, the PRCs, the Indians and the Malaysians and the Singaporeans, they are currently the generation that created the wealth and they're still maintaining the wealth. The one thing we see for certain is there's a survey that said that if you look at all the Asian high net worth, take a guess, how many have thought about or have undertaken the wealth transfer? It's only 40%. That's very low compared to the Western world. And one asks why. Well, certain things come to mind. The Asian mentality is, don't talk to me about death. And there's one thing for certain in this world is 2 things. We all will die. And second thing, taxes can only go up and not down. Right? So Asian mentality is, don't talk to me about death. The second thing we found out is that the patriarchs and the matriarchs of this world in Asia, they don't know how to let go. They want to hold the asset and the income until the day they are 6 feet under the ground. And there's only 40% are just doing it or have done it. So for wealth managers like all of us in this room, there's room for us to take care of this wealth transaction transfer. Some call it legacy planning, some call it estate planning.
Yes, indeed, it is important to plan for wealth transfers ahead of time. And second question goes to Eugene. Business owners constantly strive to grow and expand their businesses, but besides managing their personal wealth, what services do you think the bank can offer? For example, access to capital, IPO, or in improving their operational efficiency?
Thanks for the question. So maybe just give some context. Under Association of Small and Medium Enterprise, we have members from the micro to the medium-sized enterprises. From this aspect, I think through the constant conversations that we're having and from what you're asking, most of them are considering from the small to medium size, their long-term trajectory is either, some of them is to keep it internally or to sell or IPO. So IPO will be one of them. The other one would be on access to capital, because I think a lot of them now, past COVID, they are saying that how can we internationalize more? How can we get back to where we were? Right, so access to capital is quite critical at this point. And then for operational side, we do see services now being offered by banks that can help companies digitize too. And that is something that they're keeping a lookout for.
And on the topic of digitalization, earlier on we had a very lively conversation on AI and digitalization. So the next question for Alvin, perhaps if the rest have any opinions, you can also jump in. AI is definitely a hot topic right now. So do you see the technology playing a critical role in appealing to the younger generation, for example, in increasing efficiency or in elevating the banking experience?
Yep. I do believe that we must embrace technology. It is here to stay. I think we can do it on broadly two counts. One is how do we deliver service more efficiently? Two, how do we use technology or AI to improve our recommendations? Definitely for part one, process efficiency is happening. I can see the ability to use ChatGPT to generate term sheets, for example. I can see investors using ChatGPT to kind of assess our term sheet, for example. But I think it's still a long way more before we can fully rely on AI to make recommendations on investments. The one analogy I always try to use is, all of us travel quite often, quite frequently. It's quite common for us to book our air tickets online. It is quite common for us to do check-in self-serve at the kiosk instead of going to the counter, and then we walk and board. But can you imagine if you're seated on your airplane seat and instead of an air stewardess or air steward, there's a robot trying to serve you drinks? And if the cockpit door was open and you see there's no pilot, it's an autopilot, you get a bit fearful, right? So that's the thinking I have with wealth management, at least in the next 5 to 10 years. When it comes to our children's time, I'm not sure. But I think in the next 5 to 10 years, I think human beings still have a big part to play.
Okay, thanks, Alvin. And maybe on the other side of the, the other side, Eugene, what do you say in terms of your entrepreneurs and SMEs when they evaluate their investments or even within their business? Are they adopting AI?
I think what we are seeing now is that there's a lot of interest for generative AI. I think it's the flavor of the month now. If you go to any TACs or a lot of talks, generative AI is one of the hot topics, and how do you implement this for your businesses is something that a lot of SMEs are looking out at this point. Why are they doing so is because we are facing a manpower issue, right, when it comes down to hiring. So I know of businesses that have said that, you know what, rather than bringing an in-house social marketing expert or outsourcing it to a company, why don't I just put it into ChatGPT that can come out with my entire year's plan, and I just need a fresh grad to just execute it for me, right? Artwork, I no longer need somebody who has art design. I can use DALL-E to actually do that for me completely. That saves them a lot of cost. And this is why I think generative AI is such a big deal for SMEs, and we are constantly trying to figure out how can that be beneficial for us. Now, on the other aspect, when it comes to investments, if some of you are active on TikTok, or Instagram, you start coming across a lot more people sharing about how they are looking at what are the top 10 investments that I can look into in the year 2023 or 2024 that has a certain kind of returns, or there's a market that's untapped. So the younger generation, from what we are seeing, is trying to use ChatGPT now to make certain form of recommendations. They know not in the entirety it is able to give them the full picture, but it is able to extract historical data that's usually only available to accredited investors to access, right? But this is starting to shape, from what we see, the future generation thinking, and then even potentially augmented relationship managers as another means for them to approach the whole entire banking sector from an SME perspective.
Okay, thanks, Eugene. Dr. Ramadan, next question for you. How has Islamic wealth management evolved over the last few years in terms of investment universe as well as asset classes? And we also understand just now from your presentation that Islamic wealth is not just about investments, it also involves wealth purification as well as distribution. So could you elaborate a little bit further on that?
Sure. Thanks, Farah. I see two questions in that posting. So the first one is the evolution when it comes to Sharia compliant or Islamic investing. So one clear emerging themes when it comes to Islamic investing is the convergence between Sharia compliant investing or Islamic investing and ethical investing as well as ESG investing. And from my observation, especially in the context of Malaysia, for example, because this is mainstream in Malaysia and still largely niche in the context of Singapore and Indonesian onshore perspective. So this is very much on demand-driven business. And the good thing about the convergence between Sharia compliant investing and ethical investing, though we always mention, we here is the Islamic finance advocator, always mention that Islamic investing is inherently ethical investing. But if you look at the global standards when it comes to ethical investing, there is still a gap. So the good thing about this convergence between Islamic investing as well as ethical investing, that also urge the providers of Islamic financial solution to really adopt and embrace the high standard of ethical investing that has been accepted globally. So that is point number one. Point number two, Islamic wealth management, as we mentioned just now, is not just about wealth accumulation or investment per se, but it looks across the life journey of a customer. So it's about cradle to grave solution. So apart from wealth accumulation, another two anchor pillars under Islamic wealth solutions. The first one is Islamic purification. What we mean by Islamic purification or wealth purification, so how you carve out a portion of your wealth to help those in need and those in vulnerable situation. So we have zakah, we have endowment, which is from the Islamic concept of waqaf, and we have donations. And when it comes to the beneficiaries, so apart from zakah, endowment and donation is actually very inclusive. It can benefit Muslim and non-Muslim alike. And I think this is a very in line with the S within ESG, which is the social agenda within the ESG. So this is a very powerful platform to bring Islamic finance as one of the key contributors to ensure ESG achieve its desired outcome or aspiration. Another pillar is the wealth distribution. And wealth distribution, the gist of it is about the estate or the legacy planning. So the typical misunderstanding about this when it comes to estate planning, most of Muslim customers will say that we don't have to do anything because we have the de facto inheritance law, which called fara'id. And this is grave misunderstanding. So yes, you have a fara'id as a last resort, but you have other means to channel your legacy, not just to your immediate family members, but even for a larger beneficiaries and for a better common good. So for example, we have the notion of hibah, where you can take a portion of your wealth and you contribute for societal causes, for example. And then we have what we call will, where you can take 1/3 of your estate or assets and you channel to the fara'id members or inheritance beneficiaries. So again, Farah, when we talk about Islamic wealth solution, it's not just about asset accumulation or wealth accumulation, but we look at the every stage and every moment of the customer's life journey, and we look from cradle to grave solution. Thank you.
Thanks. Indeed, amongst our private wealth clients, we are seeing more interest in Islamic wealth management products. And on top of that, I do see a general closing of the gap between ESG as well as Islamic wealth management, because some non-Muslim clients actually would be keen to look at Islamic wealth products as well. So on the topic of that, David, private banks, we service clients from across the region. So does wealth transfer approach and mindset differ depending on racial and cultural background? And how would a private bank advise a client while being sensitive to racial and cultural dynamics?
If, say, the high net worth individual, take for example, is a Muslim, then you got Muslim trusts and so forth in Malaysia, Labuan as well. I don't think Indonesia has got a trust law act in place, but I think the Indonesian government recognizes for high net worth individuals to have their trust outside of Indonesia. I'll just give you a very simple case in line to your question. We have a very large trust set up where we are the administrators, and suffice to say, the family, the original family, the settlor, was of Muslim faith. And typically what we do is, it's not set up as Islamic trust, it is a Singapore trust. There are assets under the trust where we manage, but the beneficiaries, we now have third generation beneficiaries. We have a total of about more than 150 beneficiaries around the world for the one trust. What the trust spells out very clearly, because the families of Muslim faith, is that, typically if there's sons and daughters who are beneficiaries, typically the son get two set of the coin compared to the daughter. And then in the trust, from memory, you'll say that if any of my children or grandchildren remove themselves from the faith or marries into a non-Muslim faith, then they get dropped off. So it is the trustee's job to ensure that the wishes and intentions of the original settlor 50 years ago is maintained using the Singapore law. So we can cater, we don't have a specific Islamic trust set up per se, but our license, and we've been doing it for more than 99 years now, we do have Muslim clients that can cater their letters and intentions and wishes, irregardless of what faith you are. We just make sure that we adhere to the regulatory and the fiduciary obligations.
Okay, thank you, David. Next question I have will be for Eugene. Generating wealth as a business owner generally involves risk, challenges, and of course a lot of hard work. So how would you think the investment approach and advice would differ from that offered to an employed or salaried person?
From my observation at least, I'm not too certain, but for entrepreneurs, most of them do take a more calculated risk, or less risk at first, from what I understand. The sort of products that they look into are more, that's why some of them all become AIs, right? That you have to know what you are going to be buying into, and you have to manage your own risk. What we see from the employee's perspective is that they are more conservative. So from them, I do see that they are willing to take bigger bets. And that's why within their businesses, for the sort of why they're entering into the business and taking up inventory, they don't know for certain that they can definitely sell all. And for some of them, they need high inventory turnover. So and this is where is the risk perspective from a business owner that we are seeing. There's different when it comes down to investing. And on that sense, what this means is that when they are looking at products, they're also looking at a more diverse range of where they can be investing into. They're more aggressive in taking leverages, and this is where we actually believe that the bank can actually come in to support through their range of services to help with these business owners.
So they are more adventurous in terms of their product selection, and would that be including private equities, and what other things are you looking at, or would they be looking at?
some of the trends that we're seeing now is more interest in overseas properties. Of late, Singapore property prices has gone up quite substantially. But as they have gone on to do overseas expansion, they realize that there are opportunities around the ASEAN region at a more discounted price, and through their global expansion.
Okay.
Sarah, let me chime in on this. Right? So you know, when we serve our private wealth customers who are also SME owners, I think it really depends on what phase of the company's, what stage of the company is, right? Whether they are just a startup or whether they are a little bit more mature. I think suffice to say that a lot of business owners do put a lot of their own resources into the business. It's often a very blur line between what's business and what's personal. Even with some of the big tycoons, you know, I think that line is not always very, very distinct. So I think for wealth management players, we have to be very conscious of that. I think at Maybank, we are quite determined to be the bank for entrepreneurs, given the fact that we do have a large customer base of business owners. So I think the challenge is how do we kind of help them in their business as well as their personal wealth.
Okay, thanks, Alvin. Alvin, next question is for you. Baby boomers are retiring and the millennials and Gen Z will become a significant client base. So aside from digital and tech, how is the wealth management industry adapting to the demographic shift?
I think investor attitudes is something that we have to take care of. I think like we kind of talked about earlier, how we deliver our service, what kind of themes we offer them. I think the millennials are definitely more aware about ESG. So I think we have to embed those themes into our recommendations. But I think the fundamental shift aside, if you look at the markets, certain things have also changed. My belief, and I think most of my colleagues in Maybank Wealth Management family also believe that, I think gone are the days when interest rates are low, close to zero in the developed countries. I think those are gone. With deglobalization, with nationalism, I think inflation is going to be a little bit higher than the last 20 years. That will then drive up interest rate. The hurdle rates will be higher. I think for business owners, cost of doing business will be higher. Cost of borrowing will be higher. I think for investors, they'll be looking for higher return than risk-free rates. So that, I think, will then kind of cause investors and even banks to look at alternatives, whether it's crypto or private markets in equities or credits or even Islamic wealth.
Yes, indeed. Asset allocation is indeed important. Dr. Ramadan, how would an Islamic investment portfolio differ from a regular investment or portfolio in areas such as asset allocation and returns?
I think the key differentiation boils down to what is the principle of the Sharia. So we have the so-called negative list. So that itself, I think, differentiate between the universe of Islamic investment and the universe of conventional investment. So for example, from day one, even prior to ESG, prior to ethical or even sustainable investing, from Sharia perspective or for the Islamic investment, we have to observe all these requirements. So that differentiate in terms of what can be done from the Islamic investment perspective and what can't be done as far as Islamic investment is concerned. So that is point number one. Point number two, perhaps I don't see any clear departure when it comes to type of asset classes between the Sharia compliant and non-Sharia compliant investors. I think they have more or less a common appetite when it comes to certain asset classes and vis-a-vis conventional or Islamic. But perhaps one thing that, the thing that I would like to emphasize here, if we do a product comparison or if we do the instrument comparison between the Sharia compliant and non-Sharia compliant, I have to say, and I think this is a open fact, that when it comes to Sharia compliant instrument, we are quite inferior compared to the product and instrument suite within the conventional space. So it's not about the different appetites between the Islamic and conventional investors, but perhaps when it comes to certain options under Islamic investment, that is quite restrictive. And I think this is one of the gaps that we need to address if we want to really grow and bring Islamic wealth solution to the next level.
We have some questions from the floor. This is for David. Why would clients choose Singapore versus offshore safe havens as their location to set up their trust?
Oh, it's very obvious. Singapore, financial center in Asia. Our biggest competitor closest is probably Hong Kong, right? We're starting to see a lot of the old trust set up in those Cayman, Jersey, BVI. And we all know that those so-called tax haven jurisdictions are constantly being questioned. We're receiving a lot of inquiries where they want to re-domicile their trust into Singapore. Good question, why Singapore? It's a robust global economy. You have access to all the other markets. Number two, the infrastructure from a legal, tax, and infrastructure perspective makes sense. You see our fellow clients from Indonesia, from Thailand, they have their families here in Singapore. Not because they chose Singapore as their private banking wealth. Their families live here, educate here, and the bapa goes back on Monday to his factory in Indonesia. So it's beyond just a financial center. If you want to set up a trust in Asia, you can either choose Hong Kong or you can choose Singapore, right? The rest of the ecosystem, within this little small island, you have your lawyer, you have your friendly bankers, plenty of them, you have your trust people. But more importantly, I think what we see from our clients is that they see Singapore not as a tax haven. We're not a tax haven. And tax haven jurisdictions are constantly being questioned. We see Singapore as a ready, good to go. You feel comfortable that you create your trust here, assets are transferred here, and the whole ecosystem of the infrastructure from wealth managers to lawyers to tax accountants.
And the next question we have from the floor would be for Alvin. The private banking industry is a very competitive one and quite homogeneous, I would say, in terms of products offering. So how does Maybank set itself apart from its competitors? What are our unique selling points and the niche that we intend to carve out for ourselves?
Thanks. Completely agreed. I think if you look at private banking and premier banking, there are more private banking outfits in Singapore than there are premier banking. To be premier banking, you need to have branch networks, right? So only the retail banks, can do that. So why private banking? So we believe that it is, again, the whole wealth continuum. We want to start banking our customers when they get their first job, and then give them the first housing loan, and they become rich. We want to put them on privileged wealth, premier wealth, and then eventually private. So I think that makes sense in terms of how we serve our customers. Number two, I think private banking has a lot of downstream and upstream benefits to be shared across the group, right? So if we do bank a technopreneur and then he's now a private banking customer, if he wants to put his company on IPO, that's where I think our IB can come in and help. And then if you throw in the regional footprint, we can then help to connect our customers, SME as well. SME customers who sell furniture here in Singapore, for example, get their supplies from Bali or from Malaysia. Again, with our network, with our business model of connecting all the dots for all the customers, I think, private banking, we definitely can play that space.
Okay. This is probably another question for you, and I'm afraid this is going to be the last question. That's all the time that we have today. Is the growth of family offices an opportunity or a threat to private banks?
Yeah. I think it's a level playing field, right? Because all the private banks will say will face the same threat, if you call, or opportunity, if you want. In Singapore, we have had about 700 family offices set up in the last 2 years or so. But I read a report that in US, there are thousands of them. And Dubai is also trying to compete on that space. So it's something that we as wealth management service provider, have to accept, try to be nimble and try to adapt and see how we can better serve. Right?
Okay, if I can just add on to that, I would say hand in hand, because we do deal with a lot of family offices in terms of investment advisors for our ultra high net worth clients as well. And they do require the bank as an infrastructure in order to obtain, for example, financing facilities which they will not otherwise be able to attain if they just operate within the family office. So I think it's synergistic, and it is going to be a win-win situation for all. So that brings us to the end of the discussion. If I could just summarize today's panel discussion. The spectacular growth of many economies in East Asia over the last 3 decades have led to a shift in wealth creation from West to East. Newly minted ultra-high net worth individuals in ASEAN requires more sophisticated wealth solutions, be it in the area of Islamic wealth financing, as well as proper planning for wealth transfers and also unlocking wealth management potential for entrepreneurs. And of course, Maybank being a universal bank with a strong ASEAN footprint, we are well poised to cater to the ever-evolving needs of entrepreneurs to grow both in their businesses as well as in investments. So thank you, gentlemen, for the discussion today. Ladies and gents, a round of applause, please.